Hey, Cloudcast listeners. Before we get to the show, we want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Datadog. You already know that Datadog is a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed request traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. But did you know that Datadog is great for your Kubernetes environment as well? Datadog's new cluster agent streamlines data collection from large container clusters and allows you to auto-scale Kubernetes workloads based on any metric you're already collecting with Datadog. To start monitoring your Kubernetes clusters, sign up today by going to datadog.com/cloudcast. Sign up for a free 14-day trial. Try out Datadog with your Kubernetes clusters and get a free t-shirt. So if you want to get better performance, better visibility out of your Kubernetes environment, go to datadog.com/cloudcast and try out a free 14-day trial and get your free Datadog t-shirt. And now, on to the show.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, obviously, if you listen to the show for a while, you know that we love going out and talking to new companies that are kind of blazing new areas in technology. And you know, around the whole cloud native space, we've seen a lot of involvement in the infrastructure space. We've things like containers and Kubernetes, which we've talked about. We've talked about serverless quite a bit. But one of the areas that's still sort of emerging and is always takes some time to emerge because developers have different opinions on things and different things they like to do is really the experience around developing for cloud native. And so very, very excited today to have Eric Rudder, who is the founder and executive chairman of a new company called Pulumi. So Eric, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
So want to get started with you. For folks that aren't familiar with you, you've got a pretty long and robust history in the tech industry, but give folks a little bit of your background and, ultimately what led you to want to start Pulumi and get involved with the space.
So I worked at Microsoft for a little over 25 years. So we have a half-hour show, so I think if I'll spend 1 minute on each year and
Sure.
kind of stall for time.
There you go.
I got to do a lot of different things at Microsoft, mostly on the system side. So I started before we had a networking business and worked on networking stuff. I worked on databases. I worked on the creation of Visual Studio. I worked as Bill's TA for a little bit. I created the server and tools division, which was a lot of fun. Then I ran research for a little bit. Then I ran business development for the company. So even though I had one company, I sort of had a few careers inside the 25 years. But definitely the most fun I had was working with developers. And so I knew when I went through my life change and decided to leave Microsoft, both kids were off at college. I knew I would do something in the developer space, because I enjoyed working with the community. It was a lot of fun, both technically and I knew some people in the space. So I'm glad we got a chance to do that with Pulumi.
For folks that might go out to the website or something, you look right on the front page, the stated goal is essentially create, deploy, and manage modern cloud applications and infrastructure. That's a pretty broad statement, but it also, potentially covers a lot of areas that people do today with various tools and so forth. Give us your sense of, what are you trying to solve first and foremost, and then, how broad do you really want the kind of the Pulumi technology to expand into?
Yes, I think that really is the right slogan. I think we sort of used to think about infrastructure and apps as sort of separate things. Mm-hmm. And you can't do that anymore in a cloud architecture and in any distributed system really where there's, latency between things. You need to think about them together. And when Joe and I were incubating in his basement, we actually were incubating a cloud application. And when it came time to sort of do some back of the envelope calculations for what it would take to deploy and run at scale, we sort of looked at the tools that were available to do that and to run that cloud service. And, both of us were familiar with, what was going on at Microsoft with Azure and certainly AWS, and we'd all looked at Google. But there certainly was a lot of room for improvement. And so, the first thing is Pulumi loves developers. We sort of come from a developer background. And the creation of cloud native applications really was just was too hard in certain ways. And I think part of that is people had separated out a lot of important information into YAML files, and just the tooling just was not great. So we prototyped using CloudFormation, and when you start to read documentation and it says best practices to copy these sections of files, without componentization, you start to realize there might be a better way to do things. So I think the first stated goal on helping people create better applications, I think is important, and really the sweet spot really is helping developers do that, and we do that in a couple ways. I'm sure we'll get into the details a little bit more, but we do that in part by letting developers use the tools and languages that they know best. We do it in part by creating sets of libraries that allow developers to work at different levels of abstractions. We allow developers to create and share their own abstractions. And then as we moved into, sort of the management, one of the things we realized was a lot of the tools sort of created these artificial gaps between developers and DevOps teams, even when the teams kind of shared a single management infrastructure, because the tools, sort of demanded, their own, special tooling, whether it was a domain-specific language, or, sort of nobody could look at, a 10,000-line, CloudFormation file and sort of understand what the change was that we were doing. We realized that it was really important to help these people work together. We interviewed probably more than 25 companies before we even got started in earnest on Pulumi. And, the number of people that told us, well, we sort of found a working configuration and we just don't let anybody change, any of the BBC definition, period, because we're not quite sure what would happen.
Right.
And so, helping teams, work together with tooling, with the ability to sort of see what you're doing, with the ability to sort of, add, role-based access control to key parts of the application that you don't want people changing, was super important. And then I think as people move away from simple deployment and management tasks into more complex tasks, I think we heard from folks that they wanted help, managing security, managing policy, managing, cost, seeing performance statistics as well. And, the key technology behind Pulumi really creates this resource graph that allows us to expand, not just from creation and deployment, but also into management and very sophisticated types of management as well. So that really is our mission, is to help create, deploy, and manage cloud apps and infrastructure. We love developers, and it's sort of our primary audience, but, increasingly, what it means to be a developer and what it means to work in DevOps, and helping those roles sort of come together, is important to us as well.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you right, like as you said, you went out, you did your own research, but you talked to a number of companies, and it sounds like the feedback that you were hearing, and this would make some sense, where people said, look, the world doesn't lack for tools. There are tools that are out there, but in some cases, these tools, have been around for a little while. They weren't necessarily designed originally with cloud native in mind. So there are plenty of sort of infrastructure as code tools, automation tools, some things that are natively built in the clouds. But maybe they don't understand containers or serverless or some other stuff that sort of evolved over the last 4 or 5 years. And you guys really feel like there's a space where if the tools are more purpose built, and like you said, they've got better awareness of not just deployment of some artifact or some code, but also awareness of the infrastructure, the interrelations between teams. That's really kind of where you guys feel like there's a need for a next step around these capabilities. Yeah,
I think you just start to decide where you want to add value in the chain, right? And so, developers love certain parts of their tool chain, right? People love either tabs or spaces. People love their editors. People love their favorite languages. And we had to really decide, where did we want to add value? And, we sort of decided, it probably wasn't in a different, representation of, floating point numbers. And, people had good language constructs that were extensible, that had tools for componentization, that had tools for managing packages and package ecosystems and ways to do, security. And the great thing about the tools chain is pretty much everything is extensible. And Joe and Luke had both spent, huge chunks of their career, building these extensibility points. Luke built some of the most popular extensions to VS Code. Joe and I worked on, key parts of Visual Studio. And so the key was figuring out what the right extension points were to let developers be comfortable, within their tool chain and target the new task at hand, which is basically this new, cloud native infrastructure. And so we focused, in part on letting people be expressive in natural ways. So you could actually, create a Lambda by writing a Lambda, which is kind of a radical notion at the time, rather than YAML comments. And not just writing, but also, how we enable people to hook up key events, to abstractions, and how we let people, take prescriptive design and architecture that's being done by the major vendors and sort of auto-encode it into their applications. And so partly that's by libraries that we provide, and it's partly by libraries that the ecosystem and our user groups are doing. And that's one of the great things about being open source and having a large user base that can contribute.
Right. Yeah. And looking at the technology, it very much feels like you try and take those things, like you said, that can be complex, that you want to hide some of the complexity for. So, hey, I want to interact with AWS, but I don't necessarily want to know about all the things. That just becomes a, AWS cloud library. Or I want to interact with, some service. That just becomes, I want to interact with that container. So it does feel like it's much more of kind of a natural language is not the right word, because that has a direct, permutation, but it does feel like you're able to say, this is in theory what I would like to do with it. And the libraries and the technologies kind of come back and say, yeah, that's the way you would talk about this. The details are sort of, as libraries should be, sort of hide the complexity behind things.
Yeah, I think we had a philosophy early on that, we had to let developers access the technology at, what we call the raw layer. It's great to add value to opinionated layers, but if AWS exposes a property, you can get at it using Pulumi. We're not a PaaS. We're not going to sort of hide things from you. If you need to set a property or call an AWS function, you can do that. At the same time, we can add value by doing AWS specific libraries or Azure specific libraries that let you focus on, common tasks, whether it's just hooking up a simple, Docker container, into your ECS infrastructure, or whatever it is. We can reduce things that were, formerly, tens of lines of code or hundreds of lines of code into few lines of code. And then the other thing we noticed at the same time was not only were people moving to the cloud for the first time, but multi-cloud was way more important than we thought, first before we set out to talk to users. And I think it's still gaining in importance. People have sort of seen the playbook. They don't want to be locked into a single vendor. And people want the freedom to sort of mix and match clouds within tasks. And even in some cases, we talk to startups where, they might be born in the cloud and cloud native. And, there's still a role for on-premise architecture. And hybrid architecture, and especially now with Kubernetes, the ability to write an application and actually, either run it in the cloud on Kubernetes or run it on premise using Kubernetes. That's another important abstraction that we introduced. So we sort of have the raw layer. We've got the slightly opinionated layer for how to use these things, and then at the highest level, the multi-cloud layer, where to use our abstraction to get the most flexibility.
Gotcha. Can you talk a little bit about what parts or how much of it you mentioned are open source, and then maybe a little bit about you made a statement about we let developers keep using the languages they want, as opposed to maybe some domain specific. So maybe talk a little bit about, how much or what's open source, where you're seeing the community contribute, and then also maybe just touch on some of the language, agnosticness of how you go about doing this, so people aren't having to learn a completely new DSL.
So the core of Pulumi is all open source. There's a backend service that provides a nice UI on top of the product, and that part is unique to Pulumi. But the CLI, the API, the core engine, all of that is open source, and that's actually served us fairly well. We've actually had pretty solid help from the community on adding key additional clouds. We've had contributions that enabled us to target OpenStack and VMware as well, and so that decision looks pretty good in retrospect. And then sort of building on that, so the language providers are also documented and open source as well. So we sort of out of the gate sort of decided to support TypeScript, JavaScript, Python, and Go, because those were the most popular languages supported by folks who we were talking to. There's community effort now that added .NET support, which is kind of neat. It's interesting, seeing C# is a little bit interesting, and then you kind of watch some F# examples of immutable infrastructure in kind of an interesting way.
Right.
But again, it just shows that developers love the tools that they love, and when you work in a dev team, you can mix and match these things as well, which I think is another important aspect.
Yeah.
So the extensibility points are all there. The core is all open source, and the community's been great, honestly. Whether it's adding key features or bug fixes or examples or adding their own packages is something that we've started to see, and I think we'll see increased contribution over time as well.
Interesting. Yeah, the .NET stuff probably brought back some old memories for you there. You and your team, like you mentioned, have a bunch of experience having dealt with developers, having done it quite a bit in the past, having built ecosystems and tooling around it. How do you? This is sort of partially a question for how does Pulumi go out and succeed, but also something that's probably useful for anybody who has existing environments and are trying to figure out how to evolve. Like, what are some of the tips and tricks that you've found in terms of trying to get developers to kind of move towards things that are more consistent, right? It's hard to get them to, like you said, they've got different opinions on a lot of different things, from how they code to their IDE to all sorts of stuff. Like, what are some of the things that you've found, work to get developers to realize, like, oh, okay, the benefit of this change is worthwhile. It's worth looking at these tools. How much do we have to maintain legacy stuff? Just kind of what's the thought process in terms of building consensus around developer communities? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one, we're sort of blessed when working with technical communities in that they're pretty articulate about what they want, what they like, and what they don't like. And so, the DNA of the team is made up of a lot of people who've worked in the space and who are good listeners and good practitioners. And that's the first thing. So if nothing else, I want to make sure I give a shout out and a thank you to all readers for being so articulate. The second thing is that, when you think about asking people to adopt something new, I think kind of a rule of thumb I used in my career is, if you want to adopt something new, think of it as being at least 10 times better. Whether it's 10 times more expressive or 10 times more secure, 10 times easier to use, or 10 times 10x less the amount of code that you need to write. It sort of should be a threshold. If you want to really ask someone to adopt a new way of doing things, that really should be an order of magnitude better. Otherwise, you really need to work with tools. And I think that's really important. I think that, there's parts of Pulumi when we ask you to use a new library, we really do think that it's, 10x better than what you're doing today. But we realize not every application can be greenfield, right? We need to coexist, with people's cloud applications, or, with, people's heritage, inside of corporations potentially. And that's one of the reasons why when we started, we sort of, we did not say, okay, we're,
cloud equals serverless or cloud equals containers or cloud equals VMs. We decided to embrace, everything that was part of cloud architecture. And it also influenced how we thought about, language composition as well. And so I think really those two things, focusing on people's pain points and trying to deliver really order of magnitude improvements. And then, when we weren't trying to innovate, making sure that we could integrate, whether that means supporting your favorite editor, whether it means supporting your favorite notification mechanism, whether it means supporting your favorite management tools or consoles. And you sort of see that, in the product, Pulumi has a console. It's great. It's great for searching. It's great for unifying logs. But the items in our console link back to the AWS console or Kubernetes management or the Azure console, because people have a certain familiarity and kind of, customized views and ways of, finding things and searching for things. And it was important that we coexisted. And so I think really those two things are kind of the hallmarks of how we think about it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I want to ask you one last question. You guys have been in the marketplace now for a little while. You're talking to either prospects or customers. Have you found in terms of, obviously companies have sort of software supply chains. They've got mechanisms for deployments and how their dev team interact with their ops team. Have you found certain patterns have emerged yet in terms of, some of the places where Pulumi is getting kind of the most traction early on versus them saying, oh, well, we left certain things in place and we worked around it. Is that emerged enough yet to where you have a sense of, yes, this is working early on and then it expands, things like that?
Yeah, I think we got, a little bit lucky in that, we've been around sort of 2 years and sort of the adoption of containers has certainly, continued at a fiery pace. And we sort of see the playbook in many ways, as people move workloads to VMs. Now the acceleration to containers is accelerating, and we were able to innovate in a couple key ways there. I think in part we let people sort of use containers in many different ways. So whether it's letting people use ECS or changing, with one line of code, being able to use Fargate and sort of, blur that line between containers and serverless, or the fact that now, some of the orchestration battles, sort of seem to have settled around Kubernetes. Making Kubernetes easier to use, I think, is really important to developers. It's really important to our growth. And whether that's sort of standing up, raw, Kubernetes on your own or using some of the managed Kubernetes services from, the key vendors, that sort of played into our trend as well. So we definitely see the container adoption and how people think about those things, in their cloud native architecture decisions. And sort of things that Pulumi is great at, sort of intersecting in a really nice way. And certainly when you look at our future investments, it's definitely continuing to make, containers easy to use. And certainly, in Kubernetes, whether it's, again, managed or your own or even, on-premise, making that super easy to use. There's a lot of concepts in Kubernetes. And again, the beautiful thing about, libraries and componentization and encapsulation, we make Kubernetes a lot easier to use than sort of starting from scratch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was definitely a big thing at KubeCon this last year, and definitely something that as more and more people are trying to get developers onto Kubernetes, figure out what's the best model for getting them to interact with it. Should they know a lot about the underlying stuff, like you said, or do you abstract that more and more? That's definitely a space that people are interested in. They're seeing a lot of benefit from Kubernetes, but they're trying to figure out, how do I make it even easier? So definitely an interesting space and a space that's going through a lot of change and people questioning, how do we make this better? The technology is powerful. How do we make it better? So with that, Eric, I really want to thank you for the conversation this afternoon. Real quick, for folks that want to learn more about Pulumi, what's the best way to engage with your team, to engage with the technology, and maybe see you out at one of the events here in the springtime?
Yeah, so certainly you can go to Pulumi.com and find us there. You certainly can engage with us on Slack or Twitter. Our handle is at Pulumi Corp. And however you find us, we welcome you to the community and look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, very, very cool. Well, folks, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you again to Eric for the time today. Definitely an interesting area for folks, especially as they're building new applications and trying to figure out ways to get better developer productivity out of it. So with that, we're going to thank everybody for listening, for telling a friend, and for rating the show on iTunes. We will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.